The watermelon you ate this summer is a lie. Not in a sinister way, in a profoundly human way. It is the product of thousands of years of people choosing the easiest option available to them, over and over, without any awareness that they were redesigning one of the oldest cultivated fruits on Earth. The sweetness, the red flesh, the absence of bitterness, the size, the thin rind. None of it is what a watermelon is supposed to be. All of it is what we accidentally made it, through laziness, convenience, and the slow accumulation of choices that each seemed reasonable in the moment. The wild watermelon, Citrus lanatus in its original form, native to the Kalahari Desert in southern Africa, is not something you would recognize as food. It is small, roughly the size of a tennis ball. The flesh is white or pale green, not red. It is extremely bitter. The rind is thick and hard. The seeds are large, dark, and take up a significant portion of the interior. And it is dry, containing far less water than what you find in a modern supermarket, which seems paradoxical for something called a watermelon until you understand that the water content you associate with the fruit is a product of cultivation, not a feature the plant developed for you. What the wild watermelon actually developed its water storage for is surviving the Kalahari. The desert has extreme seasonal variation, periods of intense drought followed by brief periods of rain, and plants that could store water in their fruit had a survival advantage. The fruit was not designed to be refreshing. It was designed to be a reservoir. The bitterness came from compounds called cucurbitacins, which serve as a chemical defense against the animals most likely to eat the fruit before the seeds were mature enough to germinate successfully. The wild watermelon's entire strategy was store water in the fruit, protect the fruit with bitterness until the seeds are ready, then allow consumption and seed dispersal. That strategy worked in the Kalahari for millions of years before humans arrived and started interfering with it. Humans in northeastern Africa, most likely in what is now Sudan, began cultivating watermelons approximately 5,000 years ago. The evidence is clear. Watermelon seeds appear in Egyptian archaeological sites dating to around 3000 BCE, and watermelon images appear in Egyptian tomb paintings from around 2000 BCE. There's a famous tomb painting at Luxor that shows a fruit botanist have identified as a watermelon being carried as an offering. This was not a fruit anyone was eating for pleasure in the way we eat it now. The early cultivated watermelon was used primarily as a water source, a portable container of liquid that could be carried across desert terrain without a vessel. You ate it for hydration. The flavor was not particularly the point. Here is where the laziness enters the story. When humans began selecting which watermelon plants to propagate, the criteria were practical and immediate. Which fruits are easiest to harvest, easiest to carry, easiest to eat. Fruits with thicker rind survive transport better, so people chose them. Not because they wanted thicker rinds as a feature, but because those plants were simply more convenient to work with. Fruits with slightly less bitterness were more palatable, so people chose those too, not as part of a breeding program, but because when you're thirsty in a desert and you have 2 watermelons available, you eat the one that tastes better. Fruits with more water content were more useful as a hydration source, so plants producing wetter fruit were replanted rather than left to reseed naturally. None of these choices required any understanding of genetics. None of them required any deliberate plan to redesign the fruit. They required only that, over thousands of growing seasons, people consistently chose the easiest, most convenient, most immediately useful option available to them. The cumulative effect of those choices across millennia was a fruit that gradually became less bitter, more watery, larger, and with a rind that was easier to cut. Not because anyone wanted to create a new fruit, because everyone was making the laziest rational choice available in the moment. The ancient watermelons that spread from Africa into the Mediterranean world, through Egypt, through the Levant, through Greece and Rome, were still far from what we have now. Roman records describe watermelons being cultivated and eaten, but the descriptions suggest something significantly smaller, less sweet, and with more prominent seeds than the modern variety. The Romans valued it primarily as a food with medicinal properties, a cooling fruit for hot weather, with some value as a digestive remedy. rather than as something eaten purely for flavor. The sweetness that makes watermelon desirable as a dessert fruit today simply wasn't present in anything like its current intensity. The shift towards sweeter, redder flesh happened slowly and then accelerated. In medieval Islamic horticulture, which produced some of the most sophisticated agricultural science of its era, watermelon cultivation became more deliberate. Arabic agricultural manuals from the 10th and 11th centuries describe specific cultivation techniques for improving watermelon quality, including selecting seeds from its sweetest fruits. This is the first documented evidence of conscious selection for flavor rather than purely for practical utility. Someone decided that the point of a watermelon was to taste good, not just to provide water, and began systematically selecting for that quality. The red color that we now associate with watermelons, which comes from lycopene, the same pigment that makes tomatoes red, became more intense through this process because sweeter flesh tends to correlate with higher lycopene content. People were selecting for sweetness and accidentally selecting for redness at the same time, without understanding the connection. By the time watermelon cultivation reached Europe in meaningful quantities, roughly the 10th century through the 13th century, spreading through the Moorish presence in Spain and through the Crusades, the fruit was recognizably more similar to what we eat today than what grew in the Kalahari. But it was still not the watermelon, you know. Medieval European watermelons were smaller, seedier, less uniformly sweet, and with a flavor profile that people who have reconstructed historical varieties describe as more complex and variable. Sometimes better than modern watermelons at specific qualities, sometimes significantly worse. The uniformity we associate with modern watermelon is itself a product of selection, and it came later. The watermelon that arrived in the Americas came with colonizers in the 16th century, and it found conditions in the New World that accelerated its development in ways the Old World hadn't provided. In the southern United States, in Brazil, in the Caribbean, the combination of climate, soil, and space for large-scale cultivation produced watermelons of increasing size. Native American populations in North America adopted watermelon cultivation quickly. So quickly that by the time European settlers were documenting native agricultural practices in some regions, watermelon was already an established crop that seemed to have been there for generations. It spread faster than the documentation of its spread, which is itself a measure of how well it adapted to new environments. The 19th century is when watermelons started becoming recognizably modern. Agricultural journals from the American South in the 1800s document the deliberate cultivation of specific varieties selected for size, sweetness, and color. The Black Diamond, the Tom Watson, the Rattlesnake. These were varieties being cultivated and traded and specifically recommended for their qualities by name, which represents a level of intentional selection that is qualitatively different from the casual convenience-based selection of earlier millennia. People were now trying to breed a better watermelon on purpose, and the tools they had, careful seed selection, controlled pollination, keeping records of which plants produced the best fruit, were producing results visible within a few generations of plants. The flesh getting redder was one result. The seeds getting smaller was another, not through any direct selection for seed size, but because people were selecting for higher sugar content, and the physiological changes associated with higher sugar happened to correlate with smaller seeds. Again, an accidental byproduct of selecting for something else. The pattern repeats at every stage of watermelon history. Humans choosing for one quality and inadvertently changing several others simultaneously without any awareness of the connections they were exploiting. The seedless watermelon, which now represents the majority of watermelon sales in the United States and much of the developed world, is the most deliberate human intervention in watermelon history and also the most recent. It was developed in the 1930s by the Japanese plant geneticist Kohara Hitoshi, using a technique called polyploidy induction, treating watermelon seeds with a chemical called colchicine, which interferes with cell division and produces plants with 3 sets of chromosomes instead of the normal 2. A triploid plant, 3 chromosome sets, cannot produce viable seeds because its reproductive cells can't divide correctly. The resulting fruit has the small, white, soft seed remnants you find in modern seedless watermelons, which are not true seeds at all, but undeveloped seed coats containing no viable genetic material. The seedless watermelon took several decades to reach commercial viability and mainstream adoption. The technique was known from the 1930s, but the commercial production of reliable seedless varieties at scale didn't become practical until the 1990s, when improved triploid varieties and better growing techniques made the economics work. The reason consumers adopted seedless watermelons so enthusiastically when they became available is the same reason that drove every previous step in watermelon history: convenience. Seeds are inconvenient. Spitting seeds, or cutting around them, or accidentally swallowing them is annoying. Given the option of a watermelon without that inconvenience, most people chose it without thinking about the trade-off. The trade-off is that seedless watermelons are sterile. They cannot reproduce without human intervention. To produce them, you must plant both triploid plants and normal diploid plants in the same field, because the triploid plants need pollen from normal watermelons to trigger fruit development, even though they can't produce viable seeds. The seedless watermelon cannot exist without deliberate human management every single season. You have not bought a piece of fruit. You have bought the product of a system that requires continuous active intervention just to supply itself. The modern watermelon is also dramatically different from its predecessors in ways most consumers don't notice because they have no reference point. The average supermarket watermelon in the United States today weighs between 8 and 12 kilograms, several times the size of the wild Kalahari fruit, and significantly larger than what most people ate even 100 years ago. The sugar content has been pushed so high through selective breeding that eating a slice of modern watermelon is physiologically closer to eating candy than to eating the nutritional profile of the fruit's wild ancestors. The cucurbitacins, the bitter compounds that protected wild watermelon seeds, have been almost entirely eliminated, which makes the fruit more palatable and also removes whatever medicinal or anti-inflammatory properties those compounds may have carried. We have optimized the watermelon for maximum immediate palatability and convenience, the same two criteria that drove every previous stage of its development, and the result is a fruit that is nutritionally simpler, genetically narrower, reproductively dependent on human management, and more delicious than anything that would exist without us. It is a portrait of human priorities across 5,000 years. Sweet over complex, easy over interesting, convenient over independent. The wild watermelon still grows in the Kalahari. It is bitter and dry, and nobody would choose it over what you can buy at any supermarket on earth. But it has something the modern watermelon has lost. It can exist without us. It has been making that case quietly for several million years. It will still be making it long after the last seedless triploid in a refrigerated truck has been eaten, packaged, and replaced. We made the watermelon what it is. We made it for ourselves, and it has never been able to say otherwise. Subscribe. Every week, the history hidden inside the ordinary things. See you there.